The wind on the peak was not a simple gust of air. It was a living thing, a screaming beast made of ice and malice. It tore at her skin, ripped the breath from her lungs, and carried with it the final, chilling proof of her betrayal. Elara could no longer feel her fingers, bound so tightly to the ancient, frost-encrusted pillar that the rough ropes had stolen all sensation. Or perhaps it was the cold itself, a deep and penetrating freeze that was slowly, methodically turning her blood to slush in her veins. Below, the last of her pack, the people she had called family, the wolves she had served her entire life, disappeared into the swirling veil of snow. Not a single one looked back. Their fear of the mountain's curse was greater than any loyalty they had ever felt for her. She was their omega, their weakest link, and now, their sacrifice. A peace offering to the dark spirits of the peaks, a desperate attempt to end the blight that had fallen upon their lands. She was to die so they might live, the ultimate betrayal, wrapped in the pretty lie of tradition. Elara let her head fall back against the freezing stone. Her silver hair, once her pride, was now a tangled mess of ice. She did not struggle. What was the point? The cold was a numb kind of agony, seeping into her bones, promising a sleep from which she would never wake. Perhaps it was a mercy, the constant ache of being unwanted, the hollow echo of being declared cursed since her first breath. That pain was worse than any freeze. Her wolf, a timid, fragile creature, had retreated so far inside her it was barely a whisper. It too was ready to let go. The sky deepened from bruised purple to the color of a fresh wound, streaked with violent red. Even the heavens weep for this injustice, she thought distantly, or perhaps they bled in anticipation of the carnage to come. The ancient tales spoke of the beasts that roamed these heights, monsters of shadow and hunger that accepted blood tributes. As the last light bled from the world, a new sound cut through the wind's mournful howl. Not the scrape of claws on stone, something deeper. A vibration she felt through the pillar at her back, a steady, rhythmic pounding that grew closer with each thunderous beat. It was the sound of something massive moving with purpose through the treacherous landscape below. Fear, sharp and electric, shot through the numb void inside her. This was not the silent approach of a spectral beast. This was something tangible, something powerfully, terrifyingly alive. The hunt was not over. It was just beginning. The wind shifted, whipping around the peak in a new direction, and it carried a scent. It hit her like a physical blow, cutting through the sterile smell of ice and stone. Ancient pine and deep earth, leather and steel, and beneath it all a wild, dark spice that was purely, devastatingly alpha. It was a scent of storms and strength, of deep forests and uncharted power. It was a scent that should have terrified her. Instead, it made her dormant wolf jolt. A weak, confused whimper echoed in the back of her mind. The creature she had thought broken began to stir, pressing against the confines of her soul with a sudden, desperate awareness. It was a feeling she had never known, not fear of this new presence, but a raw, primal recognition. The ropes bit deeper as she unconsciously strained against them, her heart hammering a frantic, alien rhythm against her ribs. He was coming, and he was coming for her. Down in the shadowed pass, King Kieran stood as still as the mountains themselves. His patrol had been routine, a sweep of the northern borders, but the wind brought a story tonight, a tale written in scent that made the beast within him roar to the surface. His men, hardened warriors who had seen him crush rebellions and stare down armies, froze behind him. They watched as their king, a man of few words and relentless action, went utterly rigid. His broad shoulders tensed, his hands, usually resting easily on the pommel of his sword, curled into white-knuckled fists. His head lifted, his sharp, hawk-like profile tilted as he drank in the frozen air. There, again, faint but unmistakable, Winter roses crushed under fresh snow, starlight on a frozen lake, and a thread of pure, undiluted terror that made his own instincts scream in protest. It was the most beautiful, most devastating scent he had ever encountered, and it was laced with the distinct, fragile signature of an omega. Not just any omega. Mine. The word was not a thought, it was a truth etched into his bones and roared by his wolf, a possessive, feral hunger ignited in his gut, hotter than any battle lust. Your Majesty? His beta, a man with a face scarred from a dozen battles, took a cautious step forward. He did not hear him. The world had narrowed to that scent, to the desperate thread of fear within it. Something was hurting what was his. Someone had dared to threaten his mate. A low, warning growl rumbled in his chest, a sound so deeply predatory his men instinctively fell back a step. Without a word, without a command, he moved. He didn't bother with the careful path. He shifted in mid-stride, a violent, awe-inspiring transformation of cracking bone and expanding muscle. Where a man had stood, now stood a wolf of legend. His fur was the color of a midnight storm, shades of deepest gray and black that seemed to swallow the fading light. He stood taller than a warhorse, muscles coiled like steel springs, and his eyes glowed with an unnatural, fiery amber light. The simple iron circlet of his rank still rested, impossibly, between his ears. He spared no glance for his stunned warriors. With a powerful thrust of his hind legs, he launched himself up the sheer rock face, claws finding purchase where no paw should hold. The hunt was over. The retrieval had begun. The mountain fought him. Ice shattered under his weight. Stones loosened and careened into the abyss below. He did not care. The scent was a beacon, a siren song pulling him upward with a force stronger than gravity. With every bound, the smell grew stronger, sweeter, more tainted with fear. His wolf was in a frenzy, a single-minded drive to reach, to protect, to claim. Elara heard the final approach, the dislodgement of a small rock slide, the heavy panting breaths that fogged the air in great plumes. She squeezed her eyes shut, bracing for the end. This was the beast of the peak. This was her death. A shadow fell over her, blocking the last crimson light of the sky. The temperature seemed to drop another degree. Slowly, trembling so violently her teeth chattered, she forced her eyes open. The creature before her was not a mindless monster. It was a wolf of impossible size and majesty, its powerful frame etched against the twilight. It stared at her, its massive head tilted, nostrils flaring as it took in her scent. Then it stepped closer. She flinched, waiting for the snap of jaws, the tear of fangs. Instead, a warmth radiated from it, cutting through the deadly chill. It stopped so close she could feel the heat of its breath, see the intricate patterns in its dark fur. It made a soft, confused sound in the back of its throat, not a growl, but a rumble that vibrated through the stone and into her bones. And then it shifted. The transformation was fluid, powerful. The wolf dissolved into the form of a man who knelt before her. He was bare-chested in the killing cold, skin marred by the silvery maps of old battles, muscles defined not for show, but for survival. His hair was as dark as his wolf's pelt, falling around a face that was all harsh angles and commanding strength. And his eyes, they were the same burning amber, holding hers with an intensity that stole the last remnants of her breath. For a long moment, there was only the howl of the wind and the thunder of her own heart. His gaze swept over her, from her ice-crusted hair to the raw, bleeding wounds on her wrists, and something dangerous flickered in those amber depths, a quiet, terrifying fury. His hands, large and scarred, came up to the ropes. They were not gentle with the frozen fibers, but they were infinitely careful with her. She saw, with a shock that cut through her stupor, that those capable, lethal hands were trembling. "Who are you?" The words left her lips in a frozen, broken whisper, the sound barely audible over the wind. His eyes lifted back to hers. His voice, when it came, was deep and rough, weathered with wind and command, yet it held a strange, unexpected softness. "Kieran," he said, as the last rope fell apart. His fingers gently encircled her ruined wrists, his touch a brand of heat against her frozen skin. He leaned closer, his scent wrapping around her like a shelter. His amber eyes held hers, and the world, the cold, the betrayal, all of it narrowed to this point, to this man, this king who looked at her, a broken, sacrificed Omega, not with pity or disgust, but with a bewildering, possessive awe. "You," he breathed, the word a vow and a revelation. "You are mine." Kieran's warmth was a shock to Elara's system, a lifeline thrown into a frozen sea. He gathered her against his chest, his fur-lined cloak swallowing her shivering form. The heat of his skin seeped through the layers, a stark, beautiful agony against her icy flesh. She should have protested. She should have been terrified of this powerful stranger, this king who moved like a storm. But her body, starved of warmth and safety for so long, made the decision for her. She went limp against him, her head finding the hollow of his shoulder, her eyes fluttering closed. He moved with a predator's grace down the treacherous slope, his grip on her unyielding yet impossibly gentle. Each sure-footed step was a silent rebuke to the mountain that had tried to claim her. Elara drifted in a haze of exhaustion and disbelieving shock, aware only of the steady, strong rhythm of his heartbeat against her ear, a drumbeat that said, "Alive, alive, alive." When they reached the base camp, the world burst into a new kind of sensory overload. The roar of a large fire, the smell of roasting meat and pine pitch, the low murmur of voices that cut off abruptly. She felt the stairs before she saw them. Peeking from the shelter of Kieran's cloak, she saw a circle of rugged warriors frozen in various states of shock. Their eyes, wide and assessing, tracked their king carrying his fragile, ice-covered burden. Old instincts screamed, "Make yourself small, invisible, unworthy." She tried to tuck herself deeper into Kieran's hold. A low growl vibrated through his chest, a sound of pure warning that needed no words. "Back," he commanded, his voice a whip crack in the firelit silence. The warriors scattered instantly, creating a wide berth. Kieran carried her directly to the hearth's roaring heart and sat, keeping her cradled in his lap. The direct heat was almost painful, but he adjusted his cloak, shielding her from the fiercest flames, while letting the warmth seep in. A man with a serious face and a scar cutting through his brow, Jax, approached with a healer's kit and a bowl of steaming broth. His eyes held cautious curiosity but no judgment as he glanced at her. Kieran took the bowl, dismissing Jax with a nod. He dipped the spoon himself, his large hand surprisingly steady. "Drink," he murmured, the command softened by the concern etched on his fierce features. The broth was rich and savory, life-giving heat spreading through her core. He fed her with a patience that felt surreal, his amber eyes never leaving her face. Each spoonful was a quiet question, a gentle demand for her to return to the world. "Tell me," he said, his voice a low rumble when the bowl was half empty. His thumb brushed a smudge of dirt from her cheek. The words, locked in a frozen vault inside her for months, began to thaw. They spilled out haltingly, fractured by cold and shame. She told him of the Shadow Fang Pack, of being their only Omega in a generation, a rarity that had first been celebrated, then feared. She described the failing crops, the strange sickness that took the weakest pups and elders, the whispers that began like a poison mist. The Omega's curse, she brings the blight. She described her betrothed, Caden, the Beta's son, who had once brought her wildflowers, but who was the first to look at her with suspicion in his eyes. She told of the isolation, the locked room that grew colder as her rations grew thinner, the silence that became her only companion. "Today," she whispered, her voice breaking, "Alpha Borin himself came for me. He said the mountain demanded a sacrifice to end our suffering. He said it was an honor. A bitter, frozen laugh escaped her. My own father held the rope. The air around Kieran went utterly still, not with shock, but with a cold, gathering fury so intense the very fire seemed to dim. Elara felt the change in him, the way his muscles turned to iron, the way his scent sharpened with the tang of violence, yet his hands on her remained gentle. Names, he said, the word a blade of ice. I want every name. Jax, who had been lingering nearby, nodded once, his own expression grim. Kieran's attention returned to her, the fury banked but simmering in his eyes. He took the healing salve from Jax and began tending to her wrists. His touch was meticulous, apologetic for every wince. They will answer for this, he promised, his voice deceptively soft. For every moment of fear, for every mark on your skin, they will answer to me. When exhaustion pulled her under, he did not hand her off. He laid her in his own bed of furs by the fire, then slid in behind her, his body a solid, warm wall at her back. His arms settled over her waist, holding her close. Sleep, Elara, he murmured into her hair, his breath a warm caress. No one will harm you here. I am your shield. That night the nightmares came. She was back on the peak, the ropes biting, the wind screaming her worthlessness. She whimpered, struggling against phantom bonds. Instantly she was pulled from the dream. Kieran's arms tightened around her. Shh, he soothed, his deep voice cutting through the memory. I'm here. You're safe. I have you. He didn't let go until her breathing evened out, until she believed, in her half-sleeping state, the fortress of his promise. For the first time since she could remember, surrounded by strangers and in the arms of a king, Elara felt a flicker of something she had forgotten. Safety. The journey to the Ironwood Vale was a slow, deliberate unveiling of a new world. Elara insisted on walking after the first day, a fragile show of defiance against her own weakness. Her legs trembled, muscles atrophied from confinement, but Kieran allowed it. He walked so close his shoulder was a constant steadying presence, his hand always ready to catch her elbow when the path grew rough. When she stumbled on a loose stone on the second afternoon, his arms caught her before her knees hit the earth. He said nothing, simply held her until her dizziness passed, his gaze scanning her face for pain. That evening by the campfire, he knelt before her without a word, gently removing her boots. His brow furrowed at the sight of the blisters. His large, scarred hands, capable of breaking bone, were infinitely careful as he cleaned and bandaged her feet. The contrast stole her breath. She was learning him. The king who could silence a warrior with a look would point out a hawk circling high above, his voice tinged with respect for the predator. The man who plotted border security with lethal precision would later gather a handful of delicate, frost-resistant starflowers, tucking them behind her ear with a shyness that made her heart ache. They bloom where nothing else can, he'd said, his amber eyes holding hers, a reminder that strength has many forms. The land itself was a revelation. They left the harsh, barren slopes of the Shadow Fang territory and descended into a realm of vibrant life. Ancient, towering pines formed cathedral aisles. Crystal-clear rivers sang over smooth stones. The villages they passed were not clusters of fearful hovels, but thriving communities of sturdy timber and stone, their storehouses full, their people healthy and unafraid. This was not a land of survival, but of prosperity. It was a testament to the king walking beside her. Then the fortress appeared. It wasn't a castle of arrogant spires, but an extension of the mountain itself, a formidable bastion of gray stone and dark timber built into a cliff face, commanding the valley below. Banners bearing a silver wolf's head on a field of deep green snapped in the wind. As they approached the massive gates, the old familiar dread coiled in Elara's stomach. She was an omega from a cursed pack, damaged goods. They would see it. They would reject her. Her steps faltered. Kieran's hand found hers, his fingers lacing through hers with a firm, reassuring pressure. "Breathe," he murmured, his voice for her alone. "They are your people now." The gates swung open. Pack members began to gather, warriors on the walls, women in doorways, children peeking behind skirts. The silence was heavy, expectant. Kieran stopped just inside the courtyard, drawing her to stand beside him, not behind him. His voice, when he spoke, carried effortlessly to the farthest corner. "People of the Ironwood Vale," he announced, his arms slipping around her shoulders, anchoring her to his side. "This is Elara, my fated mate, your future queen." Elara braced for the backlash, for the whispers, the scowls, the rejection she knew as well as her own name. It never came. For a heartbeat, there was pure, stunned silence. Then a wave of sound erupted, not of anger, but of pure, unadulterated joy. Cheers and howls of celebration split the air. An older woman with kind eyes and flower-dusted hands pushed to the front, her smile radiant. She didn't bow. She opened her arms and pulled Elara into a warm, fragrant embrace that smelled of herbs and baking bread. "Welcome home, child," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm Marin. Welcome home." More came then, a young mother thanking the moon goddess, an elder pressing a carved wooden token of protection into her hand, warriors dipping their heads in sincere respect. They touched her hands gently, smiled with genuine warmth, their happiness for their king palpable. This wasn't tolerance, this was acceptance. This was a pack finding its heart. Tears, hot and silent, streamed down Elara's face. She couldn't stop them. Kieran pulled her closer, pressing a kiss to her temple as his people celebrated around them. "I told you," he murmured, and she could hear the profound relief in his voice. "You are home." He led her through the fortress, his hand a steady guide on her back. The corridors were clean and lit by torchlight, the stone worn smooth by generations. When he pushed open a set of heavy oak doors, she stopped on the threshold, her breath catching. The chambers were spacious and beautiful, but not ostentatious. A large bed heaped with furs sat near a fireplace where a low flare glowed. The walls were hung with tapestries depicting forest scenes, and tall, arched windows framed a breathtaking vista of snow-capped peaks painted gold by the setting sun. It was a place of peace, of strength. "This is ours," Kieran said softly, watching her take it in. He gestured to an adjoining door where steam curled invitingly. "There is a bath drawn for you, healing salts for your wounds." He pointed to the bed, where soft gowns in shades of forest green and silver gray were laid out. Marin guessed at your size. He had thought of everything. The sheer, quiet consideration of it undid her completely. That night, after a bath that felt like washing away the last layer of the mountain's ice, Elara found Kieran arranging furs on the large couch by the fireplace. Confusion knit her brow. "What are you doing?" He looked up, his amber eyes softening in the firelight. "Giving you space. The bond between us, it is powerful. I feel its pull. But you have been through a trauma I cannot fully comprehend." He held her gaze, his sincerity undeniable. "This room, this fortress, my protection, they are yours unconditionally. But anything more, that will be your choice, Elara, made freely and without fear. I will wait for your signal." He turned back to his task, and Elara stood there, wrapped in the softest gown she had ever worn, realizing that this fierce alpha king was offering her something she had never possessed in her life: a choice. Life in the Ironwood Vale settled into a rhythm that felt both foreign and achingly familiar, like a song half-remembered. Elara's A's were filled with gentle discovery. Marin became her guide and fast friend, teaching her the rhythms of the fortress, the harvest schedules, the healing herbs in the garden, the stories behind the tapestries on the walls. Elara found herself drawn to the library, a quiet, high-ceilinged room smelling of parchment and beeswax. Here she devoured histories of the Northern Territories, learning of the wars and alliances that had shaped the land Kieran now ruled with a steady hand. She learned of his parents, beloved leaders who had been ambushed and killed by a rival pack when Kieran was just a boy. His uncle, a hardened warrior, had taken the reins, ruling with an iron fist until Kieran came of age. "He was so young," Marin said one afternoon, her eyes distant as she helped Elara sort dried lavender. "Barely 17 when his uncle fell in battle. The pack was fractured, vulnerable. But Kieran, he didn't break. He forged himself in fire. He united the packs not just by strength, but by offering them something better than fear, stability, justice. Elara listened, her heart aching for the boy who had become a king too soon. It explained the shadows she sometimes saw in his eyes, the weight he carried on those broad shoulders. He wasn't just a warrior, he was a builder, and he was building a space for her within his carefully constructed world. Pack members began to seek her out, not with petitions for the king, but for her own counsel. A dispute between two families over a boundary line was brought to her. She listened to both sides, her Omega intuition sensing the unspoken resentments beneath the words. She suggested a shared plot for the season, a compromise that left both parties nodding, albeit grudgingly at first. The respect in their eyes as they left was a new kind of warmth. She visited the kitchens, and the head cook, a burly man named Breger, asked her preference for the harvest feast. She walked the walls with Jax, who pointed out defensive positions and explained patrol rotations without condescension, treating her questions with seriousness. Slowly, tentatively, Elara began to unfurl. Her voice grew steadier. Her smiles, once rare and fleeting, began to reach her eyes. She caught herself laughing at a child's antics in the courtyard and realized with a start that the sound was genuine. And through it all, Kieran was a constant, patient presence. He was the king in council, his voice firm and decisive. He was the warrior on the training grounds, a blur of controlled power. But with her, he was something else entirely. He brought her a cup of tea when she was buried in a book. His hand would find hers during evening walks along the battlements, their silence comfortable. He shared stories of his youth, not the battles, but the simple things, learning to track a deer, the first time he shifted, his mother's laughter. One evening, he led her to the hot springs deep in a protected grove within the fortress walls. Steam rose in mystical plumes, and the water shimmered under a blanket of stars. They sat on opposite sides, the heat seeping into her bones, the silence between them charged but peaceful. "Tell me something," Elara said softly, her voice echoing slightly in the cavern. Kieran was so long she thought he wouldn't answer. He stared into the swirling mist, his profile stark and beautiful. "I'm afraid," he finally said, the admission raw. "Every day, I'm afraid of failing them, of being the weak link that causes everything to crumble." He looked at her, his amber eyes vulnerable. "My uncle's lessons were all about hardness, about showing no weakness. Sometimes I fear that's all I am, a hard thing shaped for war. I don't know if I know how to be soft, how to be what you deserve." His honesty was a gift more precious than any jewel. Elara moved through the water, the currents pulling at her gown, until she stood before him. She placed her hand over his heart, feeling its strong, steady beat beneath her palm. "You climbed a mountain for a stranger," she said, her voice fierce with conviction. "You sleep on a couch to give me peace. You rule with justice, not tyranny. Kieran, if that is not strength tempered with compassion, I don't know what is. You are exactly what your people need. And you," I took a shaky breath, "you are everything I didn't dare dream existed." His hand came up to cover hers, pressing it to his chest. In his eyes, she saw the storm of his doubts begin to calm. He didn't kiss her. He didn't need to. The connection that arced between them in that steamy, starlit water was deeper than touch. It was understanding. It was two fractured souls recognizing the missing pieces in each other. It was the beginning of trust. The peace of the Vale was a balm, but Elara's past was a ghost that refused to stay buried. It arrived not with a scream, but with a formal parchment delivered by a grim-faced scout. Jax brought the message to the council chamber, where Kieran was reviewing trade ledgers with Elara at his side, learning the complexities of the realm's economy. The beta's expression was carefully neutral, but Elara felt the tension in the room spike before a word was spoken. "A messenger from the Shadow Fang Pack, my king," Jack said, placing the sealed scroll on the table. "They request an audience to discuss renewed relations and trade." The words were like a bucket of ice water dumped over her head. Elara's breath hitched. The ledgers before her blurred. Through their growing bond, a thread of connection that hummed with unspoken emotion, she felt Kieran's immediate, protective fury ignite, a hot, sharp spike that mirrored the cold dread freezing her veins. He didn't even look at the scroll. His eyes went straight to her, reading the pallor of her skin, the slight tremble in her hands she tried to hide. "The answer is no," he stated, his voice flat and final. "Send them away." "Kieran, wait!" The words left her lips before she could stop them. Both men looked at her in surprise. She took a shaky breath, forcing her spine straight. She was not the bound Omega on the peak. She was the mate of a king, learning to be a queen. If you refuse them without a hearing, it looks like fear, or like I am a secret you need to hide. I won't be that. His jaw tightened. You don't have to face them. What they did, I know what they did, and I need to face it. I need to see them see me, not as their victim, but as... She glanced at the throne-like chair beside his, the one that had been placed for her. As this. Pride, fierce and warm, flooded through the bond from his end, mingling with his worry. He studied her for a long moment, then gave a single, slow nod. On your terms, but they set 1 foot out of line and they will regret the day they left their borders. The audience was set for 3 days hence. The interval was a strange limbo. Elara threw herself into preparations, not for them, but for herself. She practiced holding her head high. She worked with Marin on a gown that was neither armor nor shroud, but a statement. Deep emerald velvet that echoed the Vale's banners, with silver embroidery at the cuffs. She was building her own armor, one of dignity. Kieran, meanwhile, was a storm of quiet, lethal preparations. Security was tripled. His most trusted warriors were positioned in the hall, not as obvious guards, but as shadows with specific instructions. He drilled Elara on protocol, not to constrain her, but to give her the confidence of knowing the rules of the game. You hold the power here, he told her firmly. They are the supplicants, remember that. The night before the audience, Elara couldn't sleep. She stood at the window, watching the moon paint the Vale silver. She felt Kieran come up behind her, not touching, but his presence a solid comfort. "I'm scared," she admitted to the glass. "I know," he said quietly. "So am I. Not of them, of the pain they might cause you." He finally stepped closer, his hands coming to rest gently on her shoulders. "But I also see the strength in you, Elara, a strength they never saw because they were too blind to look for it. Tomorrow, you show them what they threw away." He turned her to face him. In the moonlight, his eyes were solemn. "No matter what happens, you walk out of that hall with me. You are mine, and this is your home. That is the only truth that matters." He didn't kiss her goodbye when he left for his couch. He simply pressed his forehead to hers, a gesture of profound solidarity that sealed his promise more firmly than any oath. Elara lay awake, her heart pounding not just with fear, but with a new, defiant resolve. The ghost was coming, and she was ready to face it, not as a sacrifice, but as a queen. The great hall of the Ironwood Vale was a place of imposing beauty, designed to inspire both awe and loyalty. Sunlight streamed through high windows, illuminating banners and the serious faces of the pack. Today, the air hummed with a different energy, tense, anticipatory. The Vale's warriors stood at disciplined intervals, their stillness more threatening than any show of force. Elara sat upon her throne, not a lesser seat beside Kieran's, but an equal one, carved from the same dark oak. The emerald velvet of her gown pooled around her, the silver thread catching the light. Marin had woven her silver hair into an intricate crown of braids, simple yet regal. She held her hands folded in her lap, back straight, chin level. Inside, she was a tempest. Outside, she was calm. She was the eye of the storm. Kieran sat beside her, a figure of contained power. He wore his ceremonial circlet, his expression unreadable, but Elara felt the sharp edge of his focus, the protective rage he kept leashed just beneath the surface. His presence was her anchor. The doors opened. Her past walked in. Alpha Borin led the small delegation, his once proud bearing now seeming diminished in the vast hall. Her father, Iwan, followed, his eyes darting nervously, and there, beside him, was Kieran, her former betrothed. His gaze swept the room with a hint of arrogance that quickly dissolved into confusion, then stunned disbelief as it landed on her. She watched the realization hit them like a physical blow. The color drained from Borin's face. Her father's mouth fell open. Kieran simply stared, his brain refusing to reconcile the cursed Omega he'd abandoned with the queen on the throne. They stopped before the dais, forced to look up at her. The power dynamic was absolute, and it was entirely in her favor. King Kieran, Borin began, his voice less steady than he undoubtedly intended. He bowed, a shallow, hurried gesture. "We thank you for granting this audience. We come seeking to renew the ties between our packs, to discuss trade." "You come seeking to profit," Kieran interrupted, his voice like grinding stone. He didn't raise it. He didn't need to. "While the treasure you discarded sits beside me." All eyes swung to Elara. Borin floundered. "Your Majesty, there was a misunderstanding, a tragic tradition." "An attempted murder," Kieran corrected coldly. "You bound my fated mate to a stone pillar and left her to die. Explain to me why I should not consider that an act of war." A ripple of low growls echoed from the Vale warriors in the hall. The Shadow Fang delegates paled further. Kieran finally found his voice, his eyes locked on Elara with a mixture of horror and a pathetic, lingering superiority. "Elara? You can't be... She's just an Omega, a cursed one." The word cursed hung in the silent hall. It was the trigger. Kieran's dominance didn't just fill the room, it shattered the air. An invisible wave of pure alpha power exploded from him, a pressure so intense it drove every wolf in the hall to their knees. The Shadow Fang men crumpled, gasping, faces pressed to the cold stone floor. Even Elara felt the edges of it, a breathtaking force that spoke of ancient, untamed power. But it washed around her, leaving her untouched on her throne. Through the bond, she felt his fury, a white-hot nova of protectiveness. But she also felt his control. He was doing this for her, to show them, to break them. She stood. The movement was graceful, deliberate. She stepped down from the dais, the skirt of her gown whispering against the stone. She walked until she stood before the three prostrate men. They could not look up, crushed under the weight of her mate's wrath. Her voice, when she spoke, was clear and calm, carrying to the farthest corner of the hall. "You are right, Kieran. I am an Omega." She let the words sit, devoid of the shame they had always attached to it. "The moon goddess saw fit to make me one. You called me cursed because your fields failed, and your children grew sick. You needed a reason for your misfortune that did not require you to look at your own poor planning, your own jealousies, your own weakness." She took another step, her shadow falling over her father. "You called me cursed so you could tie your own daughter to a mountain and sleep peacefully at night." Her voice wavered for only a second, then hardened. "But your curse was never me. It was your own cowardice, your inability to lead with anything but fear and superstition." She turned her back on them, walking back to the dais. She did not sit. She stood beside her throne, beside her king, and delivered her verdict. "You did not see my value. You saw only a scapegoat." She looked at Kieran, who gave her a slight, proud nod. The crushing dominance in the room eased just enough for the three men to drag ragged breaths. Kieran's voice cut through the stunned silence. "You heard your queen. Get out." The Shadow Fang Pack stumbled to their feet, humiliation and terror etched into their faces. They fled without another word, their tails literally between their legs. As the doors closed behind them, the hall remained silent for a beat. Then a single warrior by the door struck his fist against his chest in a salute. Another followed, then another, until the hall echoed with the sound of respect, not for their king this time, but for their queen. Elara looked at Kieran. The storm in his eyes had cleared, replaced with a warmth so intense it stole her breath. Through the bond, she felt not just pride, but a love so profound it made her own heart ache. The ghost was gone, banished not by a king's command, but by a queen's voice. The victory over her past should have been a door closing, sealing her new life in safety. For a few weeks, it felt that way. Elara's confidence blossomed. She took a more active role in pack governance, her intuitive understanding of people proving invaluable in mediating disputes. She began basic self-defense training with a patient warrior named Fenna, her Omega wolf, though small, proving quick and clever. The pack's admiration for her grew into genuine affection. Kieran watched her thrive with a quiet joy that hummed through their bond. Their connection deepened daily, a shared glance across a crowded room, a brush of hands that spoke volumes, the quiet comfort of reading together by the fire. He still slept on the couch, a vow of patience she both cherished and increasingly found herself wanting to end. But peace in the Northern Territories was a fragile thing. The news came on a day of sleeting rain. A scout, mud-spattered and breathing hard, was brought directly to the council chamber. "Your Majesties," the scout panted, bowing, "the Western supply caravan, it was attacked, not by beasts, by wolves, organized. They took everything, the grain, the medicines, the iron ingots. They killed 3 of our guards." A cold stillness settled over Kieran. "Who?" The scout shook his head. "They wore no insignia. Their tactics were clean, professional. They left no scent trail we could follow far. It was like they vanished into the mist." Jax, standing by the map table, cursed softly. "Raiders don't work that clean, and they don't vanish." A new kind of tension entered the fortress, not the acute fear of the confrontation, but a slow, burning, watchful anxiety. Patrols were doubled, the training grounds buzzed with renewed intensity. Kieran spent long hours in the war room with Jax and his captains, his face grim. Elara felt the shift. She felt Kieran's worry through the bond, a constant low-grade hum underneath his controlled exterior. One night, unable to sleep, she went to find him. He wasn't in the war room. She found him on the battlements, a solitary silhouette against a starless sky, staring into the darkness to the west. "You think it's them, don't you?" she asked softly, coming to stand beside him. "The Shadow Fang?" He didn't look at her. "It's possible. Humiliation can fester into rage. But this doesn't feel like Boren's work. He's a bully, not a strategist. This was precise. It feels like a message." "A message to who?" "To me." He finally turned, his amber eyes reflecting the distant torchlight. "That my borders are not as secure as I believe. That my strength has made me a target. That what is mine," his gaze flickered over her face, "can be threatened." A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold raced down her spine. "What do we do?" "We prepare," he said, his voice resolute. "We find them, and we show them that targeting the Ironwood Vale is the last mistake they will ever make." But the enemy, it seemed, was already inside the gates. The incident happened in the lower market, 3 days later. Elara was with Marin, inspecting woven fabrics for the approaching winter solstice festival. The crowd was bustling, cheerful. A sudden commotion erupted near the well. Shouting, the sound of a stall overturning. Elara moved instinctively towards the disturbance, Marin calling after her. She saw 2 large wolves, not in Vale colors, grappling in the square. One had a young pup pinned, snarling. It was a shocking breach of peace. Before any guards could intervene, Elara felt a surge of pure Omega compulsion, the innate drive to soothe, to protect the vulnerable. A calming wave, invisible but potent, emanated from her. The aggressive wolf faltered, confusion breaking through its rage. In that second, a Vale guard tackled it. But as the chaos settled, Elara felt a pair of eyes on her, not from the scuffle, from the shadowed archway of a nearby alley. She turned and met the gaze of a stranger, a lean, sharp-faced man with eyes the color of flint. He didn't dress as a traitor. He held her gaze for just a moment too long, a cold, assessing look that held no fear, only calculation. Then he melted back into the shadows and was gone. A deep, instinctive alarm bells clanged in her mind. She told Kieran that evening, describing the man. His expression turned to granite. "You've just described Lorcan," he said, "the name a curse. A mercenary, a ghost for hire for packs who want dirty work done with no trace. He's expensive, and he's never been sighted this far east." "Why would a mercenary be in our market?" Elara asked, dread coiling in her stomach. "Scouting," Jack said flatly from the doorway. He held up a small, crude arrow, its tip smeared with a dark, gummy substance. "This isn't meant to kill. It's tipped with a paste made from bitterroot and shadow moss." Kieran took the arrow, sniffing the tip. His lip curled. "A tracking marker. Scentless to us once dry, but certain specially bred hounds can follow it." Elara's blood ran cold. "They were marking the fortress?" "Not the fortress," Kieran said, his eyes lifting to hers, filled with a storm of fear and fury. "Whoever fired this was at the perfect angle to hit the post just below our chamber's window." He crushed the arrow in his fist. "They were marking you, Elara. This wasn't a raid for grain. This is a hunt, and you are the prey." The safety of the fortress dissolved in that moment. The walls felt thinner. The dark beyond the windows felt watchful. The attack on the caravan, the market disturbance, they weren't separate events. They were steps in a plan, and she was at the center of it. The enemy wasn't at the gates. They were already inside, painting a target on the queen's back. Paranoia became a new companion. Elara could feel it in the tightened smiles of the pack, in the way guards subtly repositioned themselves when she walked through the courtyard. The fortress, once her sanctuary, now felt like a gilded cage with unseen cracks. Kieran was a controlled tempest, his protective instincts at war with the need to project strength and not panic his people. He moved her chambers to a more secure, inner room with no external windows. Fenna, her combat instructor, became her permanent shadow. Jax quietly investigated every new face in the Vale, every trader, every traveling crafter, but Lorcan, the flint-eyed mercenary, had vanished like smoke. The tension was a wire stretched taut, waiting to snap. It snapped in the dead of night a week later. Elara was dreaming of the mountain again when a hand clamped over her mouth. Her eyes flew open in terror, meeting not Kieran's concerned gaze, but Fenna's fierce, warning one. The warrior held a finger to her lips. In the absolute silence, Elara heard it, a faint, skittering sound on the stone roof above them, like claws, but too deliberate to be an animal. Fenna pointed to the corner of the room, a defensive position, and melted into the deeper shadows by the door, a knife gleaming in her hand. The skittering moved. It stopped directly overhead. Then the faintest scrape of something against the chimney flue. A moment later, a small, dense object thudded softly onto the hearth ashes. It was a leather pouch. No arrow, no attack. A message. Fenna retrieved it with the tip of her knife, examining it before bringing it to Elara. Inside was no note, only a single dried winter rose, identical to the ones Kieran had once compared her to, and a lock of hair, silver-white hair, her hair, from before she'd come to the Vale. It had been cut during her confinement. It was a proof, a taunt. We can reach you. We have always been able to reach you. When Kieran burst into the room moments later, alerted by the bond's spike of her terror, he took one look at the pouch's contents, and the storm in him broke free. A roar of pure, unadulterated fury tore from his throat, shaking the very stones. He didn't shout orders. He issued them in a voice of deadly calm that was far more frightening. Lockdown. No one in or out. Assemble the captains. Now." The Ironwood Vale became a fortress under siege from an invisible enemy, but Kieran refused to be played defensively. "They want a reaction," he growled to his inner circle in the war room at dawn. Elara was there, insisting on it. "They want me to hunker down, to show fear, so we do the opposite." His plan was bold, dangerous, a decoy. They would announce that the queen, shaken by the attempt on her safety, was being taken to a hidden, secure lodge in the high woods for her protection. A heavily guarded caravan would depart with a cloaked figure in a sealed carriage. In reality, Elara would remain in the fortress, hidden in the most secure place, the ancient subterranean storerooms that were a labyrinth known only to a few. "We draw them into the open," Jack said, understanding gleaming in his eyes. "They'll have to commit forces to intercept the caravan on a predictable route." "And we will be waiting," Kieran finished, his gaze finding Elara's. The fear in his eyes was for her, but his resolve was iron. "We end this. Today." Elara hated the plan. The thought of using herself as bait, even a decoy, made her sick, but the thought of living in this shadowy fear, of Kieran and his people suffering for her sake, was worse. She agreed. The departure was a public spectacle. The whole pack gathered, murmuring worriedly as the carriage with drawn curtains was surrounded by a full contingent of Kieran's best warriors. Kieran himself mounted his great warhorse, leading the procession. He looked every inch the worried king escorting his treasure to safety. He did not look back at the fortress. Hidden in the cold, silent dark of the storerooms, with only Fenna and two utterly loyal older guards, Elara felt the separation like a physical pain. The bond stretched thin, a tense thread of anxiety connecting her to Kieran as he rode into danger. She paced the small lamp-lit room, her senses stretched taut, listening for sounds from the world above. Hours ticked by. The silence was oppressive. Then she felt it through the bond, a sharp, sudden alarm, followed by the metallic clash of conflict, distant, muted by stone and earth, but unmistakable. The trap had been sprung. "They took the bait," Fenna whispered, a fierce smile touching her lips. But Elara's relief was short-lived. Another feeling trickled through the bond from Kieran, not the clean fury of battle, but a cold, dawning horror, a realization. The clash of steel in her mind's eye was not diminishing, it was growing, spreading. It wasn't a single ambush point, "It's a feint," she breathed, her own horror mirroring his. "The caravan, it's not the target. They wanted to draw the warriors out, to leave the fortress." Her words were cut off by a sound from above, not the distant battle, a much closer sound, the heavy, grinding shriek of the main gate's portcullis being forced. The enemy hadn't taken the bait. They had come for the real prize. The fortress, stripped of its best fighters, was under direct assault. The sound of fighting erupted above them, no longer distant but immediate, terrifying. Shouts, snarls, the crash of steel on steel, the sickening thud of bodies hitting stone. The invaders were inside. Fenna's face hardened into a mask of grim resolve. She shoved a sheathed dagger into Elara's hands. "You know the basics. Thrust up, under the ribs. Don't hesitate." The two older guards, Kieran and Olin, positioned themselves at the storeroom's only door, weapons drawn. Their eyes were not fearful, but resigned. They would die here, in this dusty dark, to protect their queen. Elara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird. Her omega wolf cowered, whimpering. But another part of her, the part that had faced down her pack on the throne, the part Kieran had nurtured, rose in a cold fury. She would not cower in the dark while her people died for her. She would not let these faceless invaders take what was hers. "We can't just wait here," she hissed to Fenna. "They'll find the store eventually. We need to move." "Our orders are to protect you here," Kieran growled, not taking his eyes off the door. "And if they smoke us out, or starve us out?" Elara countered, her mind racing. She remembered the labyrinthian storerooms. Marin had once mentioned old passages, escape routes from sieges long past, mostly collapsed. But one? The grain cellar, the south wall. There's a chute for moving sacks to the lower mill. It comes out near the old stables. Fenna's eyes lit with a fierce hope. Is it clear? I don't know, but it's a chance. The decision was made. They moved silently, a desperate procession through the pitch-black corridors lined with barrels and sacks. Elara led, her hands tracing the cold stone walls, relying on memory. The sounds of battle grew closer, echoing down ventilation shafts. They passed a stairwell and heard the unmistakable sound of boots descending. "Hurry," Fenna whispered. They reached the vast, low-ceilinged grain cellar. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old oats. Elara went straight to the far south wall, feeling along the rough stone. Her fingers found the outline of a wooden hatch, reinforced with iron, nearly invisible in the poor light. It was bolted shut from the inside, rusted with age. Olin and Kieran set their shoulders to it. With a groan of protesting metal, the bolts gave way. Behind it was not a chute, but a narrow, descending tunnel, smelling of damp and rats. "It goes down, not out," Kieran said, dismayed. "The mill is lower on the hill," Elara insisted, hope fraying. "We have to try." They entered the tunnel, single file. The darkness was absolute. They felt their way along, the sounds of the fortress growing mercifully fainter. The tunnel seemed to go on forever, twisting, sometimes so low they had to crawl. Ilara's breath came in short gasps, panic a live wire in her chest. What if she was wrong? What if this was a dead end, a tomb? Then a faint draft, a sliver of gray light up ahead. The tunnel ended in another grate, this one looking out onto a steep, wooded slope below the fortress walls. The old stables were just visible through the trees, abandoned. They had made it out. But their relief was shattered by a sound from the tunnel behind them, the scuff of a boot, the rasp of controlled breathing. They hadn't been fast enough. They'd been followed. Fenna pushed Elara towards the grate. "Go! Get to the trees! Run for the lower village!" She turned, planting herself in the narrow tunnel, her knives raised. Kieran and Olin moved to flank her, a final, desperate line of defense. "No!" Elara cried. "Go, my queen," Kieran barked, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Your survival is our victory." Tears blinding her, Elara scrambled at the rusty grate. It gave way with a crash. She tumbled out into the cold air, rolling down the leaf-strewn slope. She heard the first clash of steel from the tunnel mouth, a cry of pain. She didn't know whose. She ran. Branches tore at her gown and skin. She didn't look back. She ran for the cover of the dense pines, her lungs burning, the dagger clutched uselessly in her hand. She had to find help. She had to get to Kieran. She burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt. A man stood there, leaning casually against a tree, as if waiting for a pleasant stroll. He was lean, sharp-faced, with eyes like chips of flint. Lorcan. "Took you long enough," he said, his voice bored. "I estimated you'd try for the mill chute. A bit obvious, really." Elara backed up, raising the dagger, her whole body trembling. "Stay back!" He chuckled, pushing off the tree. "Or what? You'll poke me? I'm not here to kill you, girl. My client was very specific. You're to be delivered alive." He took a step forward. The Alpha King's treasured meat, such valuable leverage. He moved with terrifying speed. Elara slashed out blindly. He caught her wrist with ease, twisting it until the dagger fell. He yanked her against him, a hand clamping over her mouth again. She fought, kicking, biting at his glove, but he was impossibly strong. "Stop struggling," he hissed in her ear. "It'll be easier." Through the terror, through the bond, she screamed not with her voice but with her soul, a blast of pure, desperate need. "Kieran!" And then a new sound filled the clearing. Not a shout, a roar of such primordial rage and agony that the very trees seemed to shudder. It came from the ridge above, from the direction of the fortress gates. Lorcan's head snapped up, his grip loosening for a fraction of a second. It was all she needed. Elara stomped down on his foot, twisted and broke free. She didn't run for the trees. She ran towards the roar. Kieran stood at the tree line, blood streaking his armor, his eyes blazing with a feral amber fire. He wasn't surrounded by his warriors. He was alone. He had felt her terror, her call, and he had come, cutting through whatever stood in his way. He saw her. He saw Lorcan. "You," Kieran snarled, the word dripping with promised death. The mercenary sighed, drawing two long, cruel-looking blades. "I was hoping to avoid this messy part. The client said you'd be distracted." The client. The word hung in the air. This wasn't random. This was a plot. But in that moment, as Kieran charged and Lorcan looved to meet him, the only thing that mattered was the bond screaming between them, a tether of fury, love, and a vow. No one would take her again. The clash between king and mercenary was not a duel, it was a cataclysm. Kieran fought with the controlled, brutal efficiency of a lifetime of war, every move designed to kill. Lorcan was a specter, fluid and deceptive, his blades weaving a net of silver death. He was good, preternaturally good. Elara, pressed against a tree, could only watch, her heart in her throat. She saw Kieran take a shallow cut across his ribs, saw Lorcan stagger from a hammer-like blow to the shoulder. They were evenly matched in skill, but Kieran had something the mercenary lacked, a cause that burned in his soul. Her. "Who hired you?" Kieran growled, deflecting a thrust aimed at his throat. "A client with deep pockets and a grudge against rising powers," Lorcan panted, spinning away. "Someone who doesn't like a united North under a strong king, especially one with a special mate." Another piece of the puzzle. This wasn't just about her, it was about destabilizing Kieran's rule. With a feint that cost him a slice on his arm, Kieran got inside Lorcan's guard. His fist connected with the mercenary's jaw with a crack. Lorcan stumbled, dazed. Kieran disarmed one of his blades with a twist of his wrist and kicked it into the bushes. But Lorcan was not finished. From his boot he drew a small, wicked dart. He didn't throw it at Kieran. His flint eyes locked on Elara. Time slowed. Kieran saw the target shift. With a roar, he threw himself not at Lorcan, but into the dart's path. It struck him high in the shoulder, near his neck. He staggered, his hand flying to the small projectile. Almost instantly, his movements became sluggish, his powerful frame wavering. Poison, fast-acting. "A neurotoxin," Lorcan said, wiping blood from his lip. "Non-lethal, paralyzing. He'll be conscious for all of it." He advanced on Kieran, who was on his knees now, fighting the creeping numbness, his amber eyes burning with helpless fury towards Elara. "Stop!" Elara screamed, launching herself from the tree. She had no weapon, no strength, but she had her voice, and she had the bond. As Lorcan raised his remaining blade to deliver a disabling strike to Kieran, Elara did the only thing she could. She reached down the bond, not with fear, but with a pure, focused command, an Omega's compulsion amplified by mate-bonded love and sheer, desperate will. It wasn't a calming wave, it was a directed lance of authority, of protection. "Hold!" She aimed it not at Lorcan, but at Kieran's wolf. The effect was instantaneous. Kieran's body, succumbing to the toxin, was jerked back into motion by a surge of inner power. His wolf, called by its mate's command, rose with a vengeance. A last explosive burst of energy surged through him. As Lorcan's blade descended, Kieran's hand shot up, not to block the steel, but to clamp like a vice around the mercenary's wrist. Bone crunched. Lorcan screamed. Kieran used the man's own momentum to pull him down, driving his forehead into Lorcan's nose in a sickening crunch. The mercenary went limp. Panting, the poison fighting the adrenaline, Kieran looked up at Elara, his eyes wide with shock and awe. "You!" But the fight wasn't over. Shouts echoed from the fortress. The tide of battle had turned. The Vale warriors, realizing the decoy was a ruse, had rallied and driven the invaders back. Jax and a squad of bloodied but triumphant fighters emerged from the trees, securing the clearing. Kieran, leaning heavily against a tree, pointed a trembling finger at the unconscious Lorcan. Alive. I want him alive and talking. He then looked at Elara, who was now shaking that the danger had passed. He opened his arm and she flew into it, burying her face in his neck, ignoring the blood and sweat. He held her tight, his face in her hair. "You called," he murmured, his voice thick with emotion and toxin. "And I came. I will always come." Back in the fortress, as healers tended to Kieran and order was restored, the interrogation began. Lorcan, broken-nosed and with a shattered wrist, was surprisingly talkative once he understood his alternative was being handed over to an enraged Alpha King's justice. The client was not the Shadow Fang Pack. They were pawns, their humiliation merely a convenient spark. It was Alpha Vorgan, of the Stoneclaw Pact, west of the mountains. Jax cursed. Vorgan was a known quantity, ambitious, exponential, but never strong enough to challenge the Ironwood Vale directly. He's been buying loyalty, building forces in secret. A united North under a strong young king like Kieran is his worst nightmare. He wanted you destabilized. The plan was to take the queen, not to kill her, but to hold her, to break your spirit, to make you pliable, or to start a war of succession if you fell. The raid on the caravan, the market incident, the break-in, all tests, all to gauge your strength, your reactions, and to isolate her. Kieran's face was stone. And the poison, the tracking marker? My own specialty. Vorgan wanted her alive and unharmed, for leverage. It all made a terrible, cold sense. Elara wasn't just a target because she was Kieran's weakness. She was the key to destroying everything he had built. Kieran stood, the antidote beginning to counteract the poison. He looked at Elara, then at Jax. Vorgan has declared a shadow war. He has threatened what is mine. He has shed the blood of my people within my own walls. He walked to the window, looking out at his recovering pack. His voice, when he spoke, was quiet but carried the weight of finality. Prepare the army. We march for the Stoneclaw territory at first light. The hidden enemy had a name. The stalking game was over. Now it was time for war. Ironwood Vale did not weep. It forged itself into a weapon. In the cold dawn light, the courtyard was a sea of disciplined motion. Swords were sharpened, armor buckled, supply wagons loaded. The air thrummed not with panic, but with a grim, focused resolve. Their home had been violated, their queen threatened, their king had given the order. Elara stood on the steps, wrapped in a thick cloak, watching Kieran give final commands. He moved among his warriors, a pillar of grim authority, clasping forearms, murmuring last instructions. The love of his pack for him was visible, a tangible force. They would follow him into the abyss. He broke away and came to her. In the pale light, he looked older, the weight of the coming conflict etching new lines beside his eyes. He took her hands, his own warm and sure. "Jax and 2 full squads remain," he said, his voice low. "The fortress is impregnable now. You will be safe." She shook her head, her throat tight. "I don't care about safe. I care about you coming back." He lifted a hand to cup her cheek, his thumb stroking her skin. "I have every intention of coming back. I have a queen to build a future with." He leaned in, his forehead resting against hers, their breath mingling in the frosty air. "This is the last shadow, Elara. I will cut it out by the root, and then our peace will be true." He pulled back, his amber eyes holding a promise. "When I return, we complete our bond, officially, before the pack, before the moon goddess. No more waiting." A sob choked her, but she nodded, unable to speak. He kissed her forehead, a seal on his vow, then turned and mounted his great warhorse. He did not look back as he led the column out through the gates, the sound of marching feet and rolling wagons fading into the morning mist. The silence they left behind was deafening. Elara threw herself into the work of the fortress with a ferocity that worried Merrin. She organized the healers, inventoried supplies, visited every family who had lost someone in the attack, offering quiet comfort. She was holding herself together by sheer will, the bond a thin, strained thread of anxiety stretching westward. She felt flashes of his focus, his weariness, the hard ground of camp, but no fear. He was in his element. A week passed, then another. Scouts came and went, bringing reports. The Ironwood army had made camp at the border of Stoneclaw territory. Vorgan had fortified his position in a rocky defile. A stalemate loomed. Then a new scout arrived, his face gray with dust and exhaustion. He brought not a military report, but a captured courier and a message, not for Kieran, for her. The courier, a sneering young wolf from Stoneclaw, was brought before her in the council chamber. He held himself with a brittle arrogance. "My alpha, Vorgan, has a message for the Omega Queen." Jax stepped forward, growling, but Elara raised her hand. "Speak." The courier's eyes gleamed with malice. "The king of the Ironwood Vale is brave. He is also predictable. He camps at the mouth of the Serpent's Gulch, a strong position, but my alpha is a student of history and of terrain." He smiled. "There is another way into the gulch, a forgotten canyon, narrow, impassable to an army, but passable to a small elite force. They will be in position by nightfall tomorrow, a dagger in the back while your king faces the shield." Elara's blood turned to ice. It was a trap. The stalemate was the bait. Kieran's army was the anvil. The hidden force would be the hammer. "Why tell us?" Jax snarled. "Because my alpha offers a trade, the Queen's voluntary presence in Stoneclaw territory, as an honored guest, a symbol of peace. In return, the dagger is withdrawn, the gulch is abandoned, the king and his army can march home unharmed. No more bloodshed." The room erupted in outrage. Jax looked ready to tear the courier's throat out. Elara sat perfectly still. The ghost of the mountain had returned, wearing a different face. Another ultimatum. Her life for his, her freedom for the safety of the man she loved and the people who followed him. The courier leaned forward, dropping his voice. "He knows you'll consider it. He knows your history. You're used to being the sacrifice, aren't you? It's what Omegas are for." His words were meant to break her. Instead, they crystallized her resolve. She was not that Omega anymore. She was a queen, and a queen does not surrender. She outmaneuvers. She stood. Her voice was calm, cold, echoing in the sudden silence. "Take this worm to the cells." She turned to Jax, her mind racing, a plan forming with terrifying clarity. "Assemble the remaining warriors, everyone who can hold a blade, and ready the fastest horses we have." Jax stared. "My queen, we cannot mobilize a force to reach the gulch in time. It's a 2-day hard ride." "We're not going to the gulch," Elara said, a fierce light in her eyes. "Vorgan has sent his best, his dagger, yes, through this secret canyon, to flank our army." She walked to the large map on the wall, her finger stabbing down on a point west of Stoneclaw stronghold. "That means his own fortress is weakened. He's committed his strength to his clever trap." Understanding dawned on Jax's face, followed by a wild, reckless hope. A direct strike? At his heart? "The queen, he thinks, is a prize to be taken or a sacrifice to be offered," Elara said, her voice hardening. "He does not think the queen is a threat. We will show him his error. We take his home, we shatter his people's faith, and we send riders to the gulch not with a surrender, but with news that will shatter his army's morale." It was audacious. It was desperate. It was the move of a strategist, not a sacrifice. Jax's grin was savage. He slammed his fist to his chest. For the king, for the queen. As they mobilized, Elara went to her chambers. She removed the velvet gown. She dressed in sturdy leathers and a mail shirt Fenna had tailored for her. She braided her silver hair back tightly. She looked at her reflection, not a cursed Omega, not just a queen in a hall, but a wolf ready to fight for her pack, for her mate. She would not be the reason Kieran fell. She would be the reason he triumphed. The ghost of the mountain had returned, but this time Elara was not tied to the stone. This time she was the avalanche.
The ride west was a brutal, relentless test of endurance. Elara, mounted on a swift, sure-footed mare, pushed herself harder than she ever had. The leathers chafed, the cold bit deep, but she embraced the discomfort. It was fuel. Jax led 50 warriors, every able-bodied wolf left in the Vale who wasn't guarding the walls or too young or old. It was a pitiful force compared to the armies clashing at the gulch, but it was a needle, sharp and aimed true. They rode under the cover of a cloudy, moonless night, avoiding main trails. Ilara's omega senses, once a source of shame, became an asset. She could feel the unease in the land, the distant reverberations of a large force on the move far to the south, Vorgan's dagger heading for the gulch. She could sense the quieter, watchful fear in the scattered Stoneclaw border villages they bypassed. Just before dawn on the second day, they crested a wooded ridge. Below, nestled in a bowl of harsh, rocky hills, lay the Stoneclaw stronghold. It was not a fortress like the Vale, but a sprawling, fortified town of dark stone, its walls high but seemingly quiet. As predicted, its strength was depleted. There, Jax pointed, to the eastern wall. A section looked newer, less fortified, a weakness. The plan was simple, brutal, and depended entirely on speed and shock. They would hit the weak point at first light, when guards were weary and distracted by the distant hope of victory at the gulch. Their goal was not to conquer the town, but to take the central keep, to capture or scatter the leadership, to raise the Vale banner over Vorgan's hall, a symbolic decapitation. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs. This was not the quiet strength of diplomacy. This was the raw, terrifying reality of war. She clutched the hilt of the short sword Jax had given her. For Kieran, she thought, for our future. Jax looked at her, his face grim. Stay behind the front line, my queen. Your presence is our banner. Your survival is our victory. She nodded, her mouth dry. With a silent signal, they moved. Like ghosts, they descended the slope. The distance closed. The new wall section loomed. A single sentry paced above. Jax knocked an arrow. It flew with a soft thwip. The sentry crumpled without a sound. Grapnels flew, catching on the battlements. The Vale warriors scaled the wall with lethal efficiency. Elara climbed last, her hands sweating inside her gloves. As she crested the wall, the first alarm sounded, a frantic horn blast from a tower they'd missed. Chaos erupted. Stoneclaw warriors, bleary-eyed and confused, poured into the courtyard below. Jax and his 50 met them in a crashing wave of steel. The sound was horrific, clashing metal, snarls, cries of pain. Elara stood on the walkway, frozen for a moment, the reality of the violence below washing over her. Then she saw a group of Stoneclaw wolves break off, not for the main fight, but for the keep's rear gate, likely to escort their alpha's family or advisors to safety. If they escaped, the symbolic victory would be hollow. Without thinking, acting on pure instinct, Elara moved. She didn't charge into the melee. She ran along the walkway, parallel to their path, then swung down a ladder into a narrow alley between storehouses. She emerged in front of the fleeing group, 5 warriors and a richly dressed older woman. They skidded to a halt, stunned to see a silver-haired woman in Vale leathers blocking their path. "Out of the way, girl," one warrior barked, raising his axe. Elara didn't raise her sword.
She stood her ground, drawing on every ounce of authority she had learned, every bit of queenly presence, and the deep, protective fury of a mate whose love was under threat. She met the lead warrior's eyes. "The day is lost. Your alpha's treachery has failed. The Ironwood Vale holds this keep. Lay down your arms and you will live. Harm me, and the vengeance of King Kieran will be the last thing your pack ever knows." She was 1 against 5, but she spoke with such absolute certainty, her bearing so regal and unafraid, that the warriors hesitated. They saw not a vulnerable Omega, but a queen who should not be here, which meant her words were likely true. The woman behind them whimpered. In that moment of hesitation, Jax and a handful of his warriors rounded the corner, having cut through the main force. Seeing Elara confronting the group, they fell upon the Stoneclaw wolves with renewed fury. The fight was brief and decisive. The keep was theirs. As the Vale banner was unfurled from the highest tower, replacing the snarling claw of Stoneclaw, a strange quiet fell over the town. The fighting died down as news spread. Their stronghold had fallen, their leaders were captured, their alpha's gamble had catastrophically backfired. Jax sent the fastest rider they had east, towards the Serpent's Gulch, carrying the news. "Stoneclaw is broken. Your queen holds the keep. Return home." 2 days later, as Elara stood on the walls of the conquered keep, overseeing the orderly disarming of the Stoneclaw warriors, a condition of their surrender, she felt it through the bond, a surge of profound relief, of exhaustion, of a love so fierce it stole her breath. Then, on the eastern road, a dust cloud appeared. The army of the Ironwood Vale was returning, and at its head rode Kieran. He looked weary, battle-worn, but whole. His eyes scanned the walls, finding her immediately. He didn't wait for the gates to be fully opened. He dismounted and strode through, his gaze locked on her. The sea of warriors parted for him. He walked up the steps to the wall where she stood. He stopped before her, his amber eyes drinking her in, the leathers, the sword at her side, the quiet authority in her stance, the Vale banner flapping above her. He didn't speak. He simply reached out, his hands framing her face, his touch trembling slightly. He looked at her as if she were the most miraculous thing he had ever seen, not a rescued victim, but a partner, a warrior, a queen. "You," he breathed, his voice rough with emotion. "You took his keep." "I stopped his army," she replied, her own eyes filling with tears. "The news broke them," he said. "They turned on Vorgan themselves when they heard. The war is over." He pulled her into his arms, holding her as if he would never let go, his face buried in her hair. "You could have been killed," he whispered, the fear he had held at bay finally surfacing. "So could you," she whispered back, holding him just as tightly. "I will not be the cause of your loss, Kieran. I will be the reason for your victory. Always." He pulled back, his eyes shining. He dropped to one knee right there on the battlements, in front of both armies, Vale and Stoneclaw. He took her hand. "Elara of the Ironwood Vale," he said, his voice clear and strong. "My mate, my queen, my heart. You have faced the mountain, the ghost, and the army. You have led in peace and in war. Will you do me the honor, before our people and the moon goddess, of completing our bond? Will you stand beside me, not just in my hall, but for all the days of our lives?" The wind carried his words to every wolf present. A hushed, revered silence fell. Elara looked down at her king, her warrior, her love. She saw the boy who had lost everything, the man who had built a kingdom, the mate who had climbed a mountain for her. She saw her future. Tears of pure joy streamed down her face. She nodded, unable to speak for a moment. Then she found her voice, strong and clear. "Yes," she said, 1,000 times yes." A roar of approval erupted from the Vale warriors, a sound that shook the stones of the conquered keep. It was a sound of triumph, of loyalty, of a future secured. Kieran rose, sweeping her into his arms as the cheers washed over them. The sacrificed Omega was gone, the ghost of her past was vanquished, the enemy was defeated. All that remained was the dawn, and it belonged to them.